The DNA report trembled in Detective Claire Rowan's hands as she stared at the name highlighted in fluorescent yellow. 20 years of searching, 20 years of prayers and vigils and white lilies left on courthouse steps, and now in 2023, the truth had finally surfaced from the depths of a cold case file that had haunted Cedarville, Ohio since 2003. But this truth? This was the one thing no one in town could have prepared for. The genetic match didn't point to a drifter, not a registered offender, not even a stranger passing through on that rain-soaked October night when 9-year-old Lily Crawford vanished into thin air. It pointed to Deputy Sheriff Alan Crawford, Lily's own father. Claire's stomach twisted as she read the report again, searching for an error that wasn't there. The DNA found beneath Lily's fingernails, evidence preserved for 2 decades in a forgotten evidence locker, matched Alan Crawford with 95% certainty. The man who had led every search party. The father who had wept on camera, begging for his daughter's return. The deputy who had devoted his entire life to finding her. He had been there all along. But before we go any further into this nightmare that shattered an entire community, I need you to understand something. If stories like this, real, mysteries that challenge everything, you thought you knew about human nature, if these stories grip your soul the way they grip mine, then please, hit that subscribe button right now. It helps the algorithm understand that content like this matters, that truth matters, and it guides these stories to others who need to hear them, because what you're about to discover goes deeper than you can imagine. And you'll want to be here when we uncover every buried secret. Now let me take you back to where it all began. October 14th, 2003. A Tuesday evening when autumn leaves carpeted the sidewalks of Cedarville in shades of amber and rust. The kind of small Ohio town where people still left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew their neighbors' names, and where evil wasn't supposed to exist. 9-year-old Lily Crawford had just finished her piano lesson at Mrs. Henderson's house on Maple Street. She was a bright-eyed girl with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire, always humming melodies as she walked. That evening, she'd played Beethoven's Für Elise so beautifully that Mrs. Henderson had called it angelic. Lily left at 6:45 p.m., her pink bicycle with its rainbow-colored ribbons catching the last rays of daylight. The ride home was only 12 minutes, a route she'd taken dozens of times. Down Maple, left on Oak, straight past the old railroad crossing, then right onto Willowbrook Lane where the Crawford family lived in a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters. She never made it home. At 7:15, Margaret Crawford called her husband Alan at the sheriff's station, her voice tight with that particular maternal instinct that knows when something is wrong. Alan radioed patrol cars immediately. By 7:30, the entire department was searching. By 8 p.m., the town's volunteer fire department had mobilized. By midnight, over 300 residents were combing through yards, forests, and fields with flashlights cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. They found her bicycle at 2:17 a.m., abandoned near the old railroad crossing where weeds grew wild between rusted tracks that hadn't seen a train in decades. The pink ribbons were torn, twisted around the handlebars. Mud caked the tires. And there, on the white wicker basket attached to the front were smears of what looked like blood, but no Lily. No footprints leading away, no witnesses. Nothing but that abandoned bicycle and the sound of rain beginning to fall, washing away whatever evidence the night might have held. The search continued for 11 days. Divers plunged into the murky depths of Cedar River. K-9 units tracked scents that went nowhere. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team set up operations in the high school gymnasium. Helicopters circled overhead with thermal imaging cameras. Margaret Crawford appeared on national television, her face hollow with grief, begging whoever took her daughter to bring her home. And Alan? Alan became something else entirely. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. His eyes took on a haunted quality that made even his fellow officers uncomfortable. He worked the case obsessively, following every lead personally, interviewing every resident within a 5-mile radius. Some said he was driven by love. Others whispered he was driven by guilt. The guilt of being on duty that night instead of picking up his daughter himself. After 2 years of investigation, the case went cold. The FBI withdrew. The news cameras disappeared. Life in Cedarville slowly, painfully, returned to a semblance of normalcy. But every October 14th, without fail, someone left a single white lily on the steps of the police station. No card, no note. Just that solitary flower, perfect and pristine, like a ghost's calling card. 20 years of white lilies, 20 years of unanswered questions, until Detective Claire Rowan, who had been just 7 years old when Lily vanished, decided to reopen the file using new forensic genealogy technology, until that DNA report came back with a name that would destroy everything Cedarville thought it knew about that terrible October night. Claire sat in the evidence room now, surrounded by boxes of documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew what she had to do. She knew the arrest warrant sitting on her desk was valid, backed by irrefutable science. But how do you arrest a grieving father for his own daughter's disappearance? How do you tell a town that the man they'd mourned with, prayed with, trusted for 20 years might be the monster they'd been searching for all along? And more importantly, the question that made Claire's hands shake as she reached for her phone. If Alan Crawford had hurt his daughter, then whose side had the entire town been on? If you're still watching, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from. Your engagement helps others find this story, and trust me, you'll want to discuss what's coming next. Because what Detective Claire was about to discover would prove that sometimes, the worst betrayals come wrapped in the most believable lies. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and decades of confessions that had seeped into the walls. Detective Claire Rowan sat across from Alan Crawford, watching a man she'd once admired crumble before her eyes. He looked nothing like the deputy sheriff who used to hand out candy at the town's 4th of July parade. Cancer had already begun its work, his cheeks hollow, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the metal table. "You know why you're here, Alan," Claire said softly, sliding the DNA report across the table, her voice steady despite the chaos roaring inside her chest. Alan stared at the document for what felt like an eternity. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't filled with the rage of a falsely accused man. They held something far more disturbing, resignation mixed with a desperate, terrifying plea. "I never hurt her," he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. "I was trying to protect her." Those words hung in the air like smoke, curling around Claire's mind, refusing to make sense. Protect her from what? From whom? But before she could press further, Alan's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman from Columbus named Patricia Vance, raised her hand. "My client won't be answering any more questions today." The session ended, leaving Claire with more questions than answers in a town outside the station that was ready to riot. If you're feeling the tension building right now, do me a favor. Hit that like button and share this video. I know it seems small, but every share means someone else gets to experience this journey of truth with us. And honestly, you're going to want someone to discuss this with when we reach the end. Because what's coming will shake everything you think you know about loyalty, faith, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. News of Alan Crawford's arrest spread through Cedarville like wildfire through dry brush. Within hours, the local diner became ground zero for heated debates. Some residents refused to believe the DNA evidence, claiming it must be contaminated or planted. Others recalled small moments over the years that suddenly took on sinister meanings. The way Alan had insisted on leading every search himself, how he'd buried certain witness reports, the times he'd seemed almost too devastated to be genuine. Margaret Crawford, Lily's mother, barricaded herself inside the house on Willowbrook Lane. Neighbors reported hearing her wails through the walls, a sound so primal it made grown men weep on their front porches. She had already buried her daughter in her heart 20 years ago. Now she was being asked to bury the man she'd grieved beside, the husband who had held her through countless sleepless nights. But Claire couldn't afford to think about the emotional wreckage. Not yet. Something about Alan's words gnawed at her intuition, that particular instinct that separated good detectives from great ones. I was trying to protect her. Protect her from what? She returned to the station archives at 3 a.m., when the building was empty except for the night dispatcher and the ghosts of unsolved cases. The original case file filled 6 boxes, each crammed with interview transcripts, search grid maps, and photographs that still had the power to break hearts. Claire had reviewed them dozens of times since reopening the investigation, but now she looked with different eyes. She found it buried in box 4, underneath a stack of witness statements that had led nowhere. A supplemental report dated March 2004, 5 months after Lily's disappearance. The report described a tip from a woman named Sarah Brennan, who claimed she'd seen a black van near Cedar River on the night Lily vanished. The van was registered to Cedarville Community Church's outreach program. What made Claire's blood run cold wasn't the tip itself. It was the signature at the bottom of the report, the name of the officer who had received it, investigated it, and ultimately marked it as insufficient evidence to pursue. Deputy Sheriff Alan Crawford. Why would a father investigating his own daughter's disappearance suppress a viable lead? The question repeated in Claire's mind like a drumbeat as she cross-referenced the church's records from 2003. The outreach program had been run by Reverend Michael Hale, Cedarville's beloved pastor who had served the community for over 30 years. Reverend Hale, the man who had baptized half the town's children, the man who had led Lily's memorial service even without a body to bury, the man who, according to every record Claire could find, was the spiritual backbone of Cedarville. She pulled up the church's charity registration documents and found something that made her hands freeze over the keyboard. In 2003, the outreach program had listed individual child sponsors, residents who donated money to support specific children in the community. One name appeared under a program called Angels Among Us, Lily Crawford, sponsored by an anonymous donor, identified only by an account number. Claire traced the account through 3 different banks before hitting a wall. Whoever had sponsored Lily had gone to great lengths to remain hidden, but the monthly deposits had continued until 2005, 2 years after Lily disappeared, then stopped abruptly. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed impossible. Could Alan have been protecting his daughter from someone in the church? Had Reverend Hale been involved somehow? And if so, why would Alan cover for him instead of exposing the truth? The next morning, Claire requested an interview with Reverend Hale. He agreed immediately, arriving at the station with the same gentle smile he wore every Sunday, his silver hair perfectly combed, his eyes radiating that particular warmth that made troubled souls feel understood. "Detective Rowan," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I've been praying for clarity in this terrible situation. How can I help?" Claire watched him carefully as she opened the file containing the suppressed report about the black van. "Reverend, do you remember your church's outreach program from 2003? Of course, we provided meals and transportation for families in need. It was one of our most successful initiatives." His expression never wavered, open and cooperative. "Do you remember using a black van for those deliveries?" "We had several vehicles. I'd have to check the old records, but yes, I believe we did have a black van at some point." He folded his hands peacefully. "Why do you ask?" Claire slid the report across the table. "Because someone saw that van near Cedar River the night Lily Crawford disappeared, and Alan Crawford buried that report." For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, something flickered behind Reverend Hale's eyes. Not fear exactly, something more complex, something that looked almost like pity. "Detective," he said slowly. "Alan Crawford was a man consumed by grief. He investigated hundreds of tips, most of them dead ends. I'm sure he had his reasons for prioritizing some over others. Did you know Lily was part of your Angels Among Us sponsorship program? Now the Reverend's smile faltered. I'd have to check our records. We had so many children in that program. Claire leaned forward. Someone was making monthly payments in her name. Payments that continued for 2 years after she vanished. Do you know who that donor was? Reverend Hale stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I think I should consult with the church's legal counsel before we continue this conversation. And just like that, the beloved pastor who had comforted Cedarville through its darkest hour became the second person in this case to lawyer up. Claire sat alone in the interrogation room after he left, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to click into place. Alan hadn't been protecting himself. He'd been protecting someone else. Someone powerful enough to threaten his family. Someone trusted enough that exposing them would destroy everything. Comment below if you're starting to see the picture forming. Because what Claire discovered next would reveal that sometimes the greatest evil hides behind the most holy faces. Claire didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The pieces were there, scattered across her desk like shards of a broken mirror, each one reflecting a fragment of truth that refused to form a complete picture. At 4 a.m., she brewed her 5th cup of coffee and pulled up every piece of footage from the 2003 search. News broadcasts, police body cameras, even amateur recordings from volunteers' personal camcorders. She found it at 5:37 a.m. just as dawn broke over Cedarville. The footage was grainy, shot by a local news station on October 15th, the morning after Lily vanished. The camera panned across the railroad crossing where searchers gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. And there, standing beside the yellow crime scene tape before police had officially cordoned off the area, was Reverend Michael Hale. Claire rewound the footage 3 times, checking the timestamp. 6:42 a.m. But according to the dispatch logs, the bicycle hadn't been discovered until 2:17 a.m., and the scene wasn't open to civilians until after 8 a.m. when the FBI arrived. How had Reverend Hale known to be there? How had he arrived before the area was even accessible? She pulled his original witness statement from the file. In it, he claimed he'd heard about the discovery on the morning news and came to offer support. But the first news broadcast hadn't aired until 7:15 a.m., 33 minutes after he appeared on camera at the crime scene. The Reverend had lied. A small lie, perhaps. The kind that might be explained away as a confused memory from a traumatic night. But Claire had learned that small lies were often breadcrumbs leading to much larger truths. Before you go any further, I need to ask you something. Are you still with me? Because this is where the story gets darker, where the comfortable assumptions we make about good and evil start to crumble. If you're invested in seeing this through to the end, hit that subscribe button now. And leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever had to question everything you believed about someone you trusted. Your stories matter. They remind us we're not alone in searching for truth. Claire spent the next 2 days building a timeline that the original investigation had somehow missed. She discovered that Reverend Hale's younger brother, David Hale, had been arrested in November 2003 for a hit-and-run accident near the same railroad crossing where Lily's bike was found. The charges were serious: leaving the scene, reckless endangerment, possible vehicular assault. But the case never went to trial. Reverend Hale had paid his brother's bail and hired an expensive attorney from Cleveland. Within 3 months, the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence and procedural errors. The victim, a homeless man named Robert Torres, had been paid a settlement and left town. The case disappeared into the bureaucratic void. What made Claire's pulse quicken was the date of the incident, October 13th, 2003, the day before Lily vanished. She tracked down the arresting officer, a retired state trooper named Marcus Webb who now lived in Florida. He agreed to a phone interview, his voice gravelly with age and cigarettes. I remember that case, Webb said. Always bothered me how it got swept under the rug. That Hale kid was driving erratically, nearly killed Torres. But his brother, the Reverend, he came to the station with his whole story about David having a medical emergency, some kind of episode. Brought doctor's notes, character witnesses, the whole 9 yards. Did you believe him? Claire asked. Webb was quiet for a moment. Here's what I believed, Detective. I believed that Reverend had enough influence in that town to make problems disappear. And I believed he was protecting something bigger than just his brother's drunk driving record. What do you mean? Torres, the victim, he told me something before he took that settlement money and vanished. Said he wasn't hit by accident. Said the van swerved toward him deliberately, like someone was trying to scare him off. He'd been camping in the woods near that railroad crossing for weeks. Said he'd seen things. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of things? I need copies of everything related to this Guatemala mission, Claire said. Every record, every photograph, every receipt. Helen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Dear God, she whispered. The Reverend? He wouldn't have. But they both knew he would have. Because the most dangerous people weren't always the ones who looked like monsters. Sometimes they were the ones who looked like saints. Claire left the church with 3 boxes of documents and a truth that would tear Cedarville apart. As she loaded them into her trunk, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging or more people will get hurt. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. She stared at the message, then screenshot it and forwarded it to her captain. Because whoever sent it had just made a critical mistake. They'd confirmed she was getting close. If you're feeling that knot in your stomach right now, that's exactly what Claire felt. Share this video with someone who needs to know that justice, no matter how delayed, is always worth fighting for. Drop a comment if you're ready for the truth, because what's coming next will change everything. The arrest warrant for Reverend Michael Hale was signed at 9 p.m. on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Alan Crawford had been taken into custody. Claire sat in her car outside the Reverend's modest home on Sycamore Drive, watching lights glow warmly through curtained windows. From the outside, it looked like any other peaceful residence in Cedarville. Flower boxes on the porch, a wooden cross hanging beside the front door, a welcome mat that read, Blessed be. But Claire knew better now. She'd learned that evil didn't always announce itself with darkness and decay. Sometimes it wore a clerical collar and smiled while destroying lives. The tactical team moved in at 9:15 p.m., their boots heavy on the wooden porch steps. Claire followed behind, her hand resting on her service weapon even though she knew Hale wouldn't resist. Men like him never did. They believed too deeply in their own righteousness to see themselves as criminals. Reverend Hale answered the door in a cardigan sweater, reading glasses perched on his nose, looking every bit the gentle shepherd his congregation believed him to be. His expression shifted from surprise to understanding when he saw the officers, and something that might have been relief flickered across his features. I've been expecting you, he said quietly, extending his wrists for the handcuffs. The booking process was surreal. As officers processed the beloved Reverend who had baptized their children and presided over their weddings, a crowd gathered outside the station. Some held signs demanding his release. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the monster being described in whispered conversations. Margaret Crawford pushed through the crowd at midnight, her face haggard, her eyes blazing with 20 years of buried fury finally given permission to surface. She didn't speak. She simply stood at the station window, watching through the glass as Hale was led to a cell. And the sound that came from her throat was something between a sob and a howl. Claire wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. What words existed for a mother who just learned her daughter might not have died, that she'd been stolen, hidden, erased from existence by a man who claimed to speak for God? Before we continue, I need you to understand something. If this story is affecting you, and I know it is, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but because stories like this need to be told. Evil thrives in silence, and your engagement ensures that truth has a voice. Comment below if you believe justice matters, even when it comes decades too late. Your words create ripples that reach further than you know. The interrogation began at 2 a.m. Claire had waited deliberately, letting exhaustion soften whatever defenses Hale might maintain. His attorney, a church elder named Richard Moss, sat beside him, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. Claire laid out the evidence methodically. The suppressed witness report about the black van, the footage showing Hale at the crime scene before it was accessible, the Guatemala mission records with El Crow listed among sponsored children, the threatening text message sent from a burner phone purchased at a gas station 3 blocks from the church. Hale listened to it all with an expression of profound sadness, as if he were the victim of some terrible misunderstanding rather than the architect of an unforgivable crime. "I saved her," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You have to understand, I saved that child." Claire felt her jaw tighten. Saved her from what? Her loving parents? Her home? From corruption. Hale leaned forward, his eyes intense with fervor. "Do you know what I saw in that house, Detective? I saw a child being raised in sin. Alan Crawford, that man you're defending, he was lost. Drinking, gambling, entertaining darkness. And Margaret, she was too weak to protect Lily from his influence. So you decided to kidnap her?" Claire's voice was ice. "I provided her sanctuary." Hale's hands trembled slightly, the only crack in his composed facade. "The Lord spoke to me clearly. He showed me that Lily was meant for higher purposes, that she needed to be removed from that environment and raised in the light of His grace. I gave her a new life, a clean life in Guatemala where she could grow up serving others instead of being poisoned by Cedarville's small-town temptations." The casual certainty in his voice made Claire's skin crawl. This wasn't a man who understood he'd committed a crime. This was a man who believed he'd performed a miracle. "And Alan," Claire pressed. "He knew, didn't he? He figured out what you'd done." Hale's expression shifted to something almost like pity. "Alan confronted me 6 months after I'd relocated Lily. He'd been investigating obsessively, following paper trails. He found evidence of the mission transfer. We had a discussion." "What kind of discussion?" "The kind where I made him understand that exposing the truth would destroy more than just me. The church supported hundreds of families. My mission work fed thousands of children across Central America. If I were arrested, all of that would collapse. And Margaret, poor Margaret, learning her daughter had been taken by someone she trusted, it would kill her. I showed Alan that sometimes mercy means bearing unbearable truths alone." Claire felt nausea rising in her throat. "You threatened him. You made him choose between exposing you and protecting his wife." "I gave him an option," Hale corrected gently. "Stay silent and I'd allow him annual photographs proving Lily was alive and thriving. Speak out and I'd disappear with her completely, and he'd never know if she was safe again. He chose love over justice, Detective. Many fathers would have done the same." "You're a monster," Claire whispered. "I'm a servant of God," Hale replied without hesitation. "And someday when you see how Lily has flourished in her mission work, how many lives she's touched with the education and values I provided, you'll understand that what I did was necessary. Sometimes salvation requires sacrifice." His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Hale shook it off. He was confessing now, unable to stop himself, driven by the same zealous certainty that had guided every decision for 20 years. Alan's DNA under her fingernails, that was from the night he tried to take her back. He'd tracked us to a temporary safe house before we left for Guatemala. He grabbed her, tried to pull her away. She fought him because she didn't understand. She'd already been with me for 3 weeks by then, and I'd begun helping her see the truth about her father's sins. When I intervened, she clung to me. She chose me, Detective. Even as a child, she knew where she truly belonged. Claire had heard enough. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Reverend Michael Hale, you're being charged with kidnapping, child abduction across international borders, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Your confession has been recorded and will be used against you in court. As officers led him away, Hale turned back to Claire with an expression of serene confidence that chilled her to the bone. Find her, Detective, bring her home. And when you do, ask her yourself if she's grateful for the life I gave her. Ask her if she'd rather have stayed in Cedarville drowning in mediocrity. You'll see I was right. The hallway fell silent after he was gone, leaving only the echo of a madman's certainty and the weight of a truth that Claire wasn't sure anyone was ready to hear. If you're still here watching this unfold, comment below and tell me, how do you even begin to heal from something like this? Because what comes next isn't just about finding Lily. It's about discovering whether redemption is possible when the damage runs this deep. Share this video. Someone in your life needs to know that even the most trusted voices can hide the darkest secrets. The photograph arrived at the station 3 days after Hale's confession. Not digitally, not through any traceable means, but in a manila envelope slipped through the mail slot at 4 a.m. when the security cameras were being swapped during shift change. Inside was a single Polaroid, faded and creased from years of handling, showing a young girl, maybe 13 or 14, standing beside a concrete building with mountains in the background. The girl had auburn hair and eyes that Claire recognized instantly, even though she'd only seen them in childhood photos. Lily Crawford, alive, older, staring at the camera with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, something more complex hovering at the corners of her mouth. On the back, written in Alan Crawford's shaky handwriting, Guatemala 2008, she's safe, that's all that matters. Claire's hands trembled as she held the evidence of Alan's impossible choice. Proof that he'd known his daughter was alive for 15 years and said nothing. The weight of that silence must have been crushing, eating him alive from the inside while he maintained the charade of grief for his wife, for the town, for everyone who believed Lily was dead. She thought of the white lilies left on the station steps every year. Not memorials for the dead, but desperate prayers for the living. Alan's annual vigil wasn't about mourning, it was about penance. If you're feeling the weight of this revelation right now, I want you to do something for me. Take a moment and really think about the impossible choices people make when faced with unimaginable circumstances. Then hit that like button and subscribe, because understanding stories like this, really sitting with their complexity, that's how we develop empathy for the broken, messy reality of human existence. Comment if you've ever had to choose between two unbearable options. Your story matters. Claire assembled an international task force within hours. Working with Interpol, Guatemalan authorities, and the FBI's International Operations Division, they began the painstaking process of locating a woman who probably didn't even know she'd been missing. The mission records provided a starting point, Aldea Esperanza, a small village in the Western Highlands near Quetzaltenango. The orphanage Hale had partnered with was called Casa de Luz, a modest facility that had closed in 2011 due to funding issues. But former staff members were tracked down, and one elderly woman named Rosa Martinez remembered Lucia, the American girl Reverend Hale had brought. She was quiet, Rosa told investigators through a translator. Obedient. The Reverend visited her every few months, always bringing supplies and money. He said her parents had died in an accident, that she had no one else. We believed him. Why wouldn't we? He was a man of God. Lucia, the name Hale had given her, stripping away even her identity, had stayed at Casa de Luz until she was 16, Then she'd moved to a larger mission compound in a neighboring village, working as a teacher's assistant while completing her education through correspondence courses Hale had arranged. The investigators found her current location through church records that Hale had meticulously maintained, even from his cell. She was living in San Pedro La Laguna, a village on the shores of Lake Atitlan, working as a teacher at a small community school. She went by Lucia Mendoza now, having taken the surname of the woman who'd fostered her after Casa de Luz closed. Claire flew to Guatemala with Margaret Crawford, who'd insisted on coming despite her fragile mental state. The flight was silent, both women lost in private hurricanes of hope and terror. What do you say to a daughter who's been gone for 20 years? What do you say to a mother whose grief has been both validated and violated? They arrived in San Pedro at dawn, the lake shimmering like hammered silver beneath volcanic peaks. The town was beginning to wake, women carrying baskets of tortillas, fishermen preparing boats, children running toward school with backpacks bouncing. Claire found the school easily. A simple concrete building painted bright yellow with colorful murals of quetzal birds and corn plants. Through an open window, she heard a woman's voice speaking Spanish, patient and warm, teaching a lesson about fractions. They waited until recess, watching from a respectful distance as the teacher emerged. A woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, wearing jeans and a local huipil blouse. She was laughing with students, her face open and kind, completely unaware that her entire world was about to shatter. Margaret made a sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. That's her. Oh God, that's my baby. Claire approached slowly, showing her credentials to the school director first, explaining the situation in quiet Spanish. The director's face went pale, but she nodded and called Lucia inside. The moment stretched like taffy as Lucia walked toward them, curiosity rather than alarm in her expression. Up close, the resemblance to the missing child photos was undeniable. Same spattering of freckles across her nose, same slight asymmetry in her smile, same eyes that held both intelligence and gentleness. "Señorita Mendoza," Claire began in English, watching for recognition. "My name is Detective Claire Rowan. I'm from Cedarville, Ohio, in the United States." Lucia's expression remained polite but confused. "Yes, how can I help you? I need to ask you some difficult questions. Do you remember anything about your life before you came to Guatemala? Anything about your childhood before you were 9 years old?" Something flickered across Lucia's face, a shadow of memory or perhaps just confusion. "I was very young when I came here. Reverend Hale told me my parents died in an accident. He said he was bringing me somewhere safe where I could have a new beginning." "Do you remember their names, your parents' names?" Lucia hesitated, her brow furrowing. No. The Reverend said it was better not to dwell on the past, that remembering would only bring pain. He helped me create a new life here, gave me purpose and education. I owe him everything." Margaret stepped forward then, unable to contain herself any longer. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the daughter she'd mourned for 2 decades. "Lily," she whispered, "your name is Lily Crawford and I'm your mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia stared at Margaret with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that might have been recognition buried so deep it had almost disappeared entirely. "No," Lucia said slowly, but her voice lacked conviction. "No, that's not. I'm Lucia. I've always been Lucia." Claire pulled out the childhood photos. Lily at her piano recital, Lily blowing out candles on her 9th birthday cake, Lily with her pink bicycle and rainbow ribbons. She watched Lucia's face as each image registered, saw the walls the woman had built around her past beginning to crack. "Look at these photos," Claire said gently. "Really look at them. Do you recognize this girl?" Lucia's hand shook as she took the photos. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at images of a child she couldn't quite remember being. Then something broke, some dam that had held back 20 years of stolen memories, and she whispered, "I had a bicycle. Pink ribbons. I remember pink ribbons in the wind." Margaret sobbed openly now, reaching for her daughter but stopping short, afraid of shattering this fragile moment of recognition. "There was music," Lucia continued, her voice distant. "Piano music. Someone taught me, Mrs. Henderson. Her name was Mrs. Henderson and she had cats. 3 cats. How do I know that?" "Because you lived it," Claire said. "Because those memories are real. Your name is Lily Crawford. You were taken from Cedarville, Ohio, on October 14th, 2003, and your mother has been searching for you ever since." Lucia, Lily, looked at Margaret then with eyes full of confusion, grief, and the beginning of something that might become recognition. "I don't understand. Why would he lie? Why would Reverend Hale do this?" "Because he believed he was saving you," Claire said. "But what he actually did was steal your entire life." The woman who had been Lucia Mendoza for 20 years collapsed into a chair, her carefully constructed identity crumbling around her. And Margaret Crawford, who had mourned an empty grave for 2 decades, knelt beside her daughter and wept. Not tears of joy exactly, but tears of loss for all the years that could never be reclaimed. If you're still watching, comment below. Tell me if you think a person can ever truly recover from having their entire childhood erased. Share this video, because somewhere, someone needs to know that even the most impossible truths eventually surface. The reunion wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One that would test everything both women thought they knew about identity, forgiveness, and what it means to come home to a place you can't remember leaving. Lily pressed her palm against the airplane window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I don't remember him. I've tried, ever since you showed me those photos, but there's just nothing. It's like that little girl in the pictures is someone else entirely." "That's what trauma does," Claire said from the seat across the aisle. She'd been quiet for most of the flight, giving mother and daughter space. "Your mind protected you by erasing what it couldn't process. But memories can come back, especially when you're in familiar places. Cedarville might trigger things you didn't know you'd forgotten." The homecoming was surreal. News crews lined the streets as their police escort drove through town. Signs hung from storefronts. "Welcome home, Lily," and "Cedarville's miracle." People stood on sidewalks weeping openly, holding balloons and flowers, celebrating the return of a girl who'd become a symbol of their collective grief. But Lily felt like an imposter. These people were celebrating someone who didn't exist anymore, the 9-year-old girl frozen in their memories. They didn't know Lucia, the woman who'd spent 15 years teaching children in Guatemalan villages, who spoke better Spanish than English now, who'd built an entire identity in the absence of the one that had been stolen. The Crawford house on Willowbrook Lane looked exactly as it had in the photos Claire had shown her, but smaller somehow, more fragile. Margaret had maintained it like a shrine, Lily's bedroom preserved exactly as it had been the night she disappeared. Piano trophies on the shelf, a Beethoven music book still open on the stand, stuffed animals arranged on a bed that hadn't been slept in for 2 decades. Lily stood in the doorway of that room and felt nothing. No recognition, no sense of belonging. Just the crushing weight of expectation from a town that wanted their miracle, regardless of what it cost her. That night, unable to sleep in the bedroom that should have been hers, Lily found herself in the kitchen at 3 a.m. She discovered Margaret there too, sitting at the table with a photo album spread before her. 20 years of pictures documenting the life Lily had lived in Guatemala. Claire had provided them, evidence collected during the investigation. "You were beautiful," Margaret whispered, touching a photo of teenage Lucia teaching a classroom full of children. even in the life he stole, even without us. You became someone beautiful." Lily sat down across from her mother, a word that still felt strange in her mouth. "I was happy there. I know I shouldn't say that. I know it's not what you want to hear. But I had purpose. I had students who needed me. I had a community. And now I'm here, in a place I can't remember, surrounded by people mourning someone I'm not sure I ever was." Margaret's face crumpled. "I don't want you to feel guilty for surviving, for building a life. I'm grateful you weren't suffering somewhere, that you found meaning even in the wrong place. But Lily..." Her voice broke. "We lost 20 years. Your father died without holding you again. I buried him 3 weeks ago and you weren't there. We can't get any of that back." "I know," Lily said softly. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it, but I'm also angry. I'm angry that Reverend Hale stole my choice. I'm angry that my father, Alan, he knew where I was and didn't tell you. I'm angry that I spent 20 years believing a lie, and now I'm expected to just slot back into a life that doesn't fit anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with grief that had no outlet, no resolution. This was the truth that nobody talked about in miracle reunion stories. Sometimes the damage was too deep, the time lost too vast. Sometimes coming home meant discovering you no longer had a home to come back to. Over the next few days, Lily met with therapists specializing in recovered memory and childhood trauma. She visited Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, who wept and played Für Elise with arthritic fingers. She walked past the railroad crossing where her bicycle had been found, and for just a moment she felt something. A flash of terror, the sensation of pedaling fast, trying to get home before dark. But the memories remained fragments, broken pieces that didn't quite fit together. Then Margaret brought her something that changed everything. A sealed envelope that Alan had left with his will, labeled, "For Lily when she comes home." Inside was a cassette tape and a letter written in shaking handwriting, dated 3 weeks before his death. Lily's hands trembled as she loaded the tape into an old player Margaret had kept. Alan's voice filled the room, weaker than she'd heard in videos, eaten away by cancer and time, but still carrying the weight of a father's love. "Lily, if you're hearing this, then you're home, and I'm sorry I can't be there to see you. I'm sorry for so many things, but mostly I'm sorry for the choice I made 20 years ago." The tape continued, Alan's voice breaking as he explained everything. The confrontation with Hale, the impossible ultimatum, the annual photographs he'd been sent proving she was alive. He described watching her grow up through those stolen images, celebrating birthdays from afar, grieving not her death but her absence. "I know what I did was cowardly," Alan's voice crackled through the speakers. "I should have exposed him immediately, should have fought to bring you home regardless of the consequences. But I was terrified. Terrified he'd disappear with you completely. Terrified of what the truth would do to your mother. Terrified that by the time we found you, you wouldn't remember us anyway and we'd just be strangers disrupting the only life you knew." Lily closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the father she couldn't remember explain why he'd made the choice that haunted him until death. "I hope someday you can forgive me," Alan continued. "Not for failing you, that's unforgivable. But for being human, for being weak, for choosing the smallest hope of knowing you were alive over the gamble of possibly losing you forever. I love you, Lily. I never stopped. And even though I won't be there to say it in person, know that every white lily left on those courthouse steps was a promise. A promise that I never gave up, even when silence was all I had left." The tape ended with the soft click of a recorder being turned off, leaving Lily and Margaret sobbing in each other's arms. Finally, truly grieving together for the man who'd carried an impossible burden alone. If you're still here, watching this unfold, comment below and tell me what you would have done in Alan's position. There's no right answer. That's what makes this so devastating. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that love sometimes looks like impossible, imperfect choices. Because what came next would test whether forgiveness was possible, when everyone involved was both victim and survivor of the same unforgivable crime. The trial of Reverend Michael Hale began on a gray morning in April, 6 months after Lily's return to Cedarville. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, standing room only, with overflow crowds watching on screens set up in the adjacent park. This wasn't just a trial. It was Cedarville's reckoning with itself, with the man they'd trusted, with the comfortable lies they'd chosen to believe. Lily sat in the front row beside Margaret, wearing a navy dress that Margaret had bought for her. Another small attempt to bridge the gap between who Lily had been and who she'd become. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but Lily could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on her back, the town's desperate need for her to be their miracle, their proof that good could emerge from unspeakable evil. Claire sat 2 rows behind them, having been called as the lead witness. She'd spent months building an airtight case, financial records showing Hale had embezzled church funds to finance the abduction, testimony from Rosa Martinez and other Casa de Luz staff members, Alan's confession tape, and most damningly, Hale's own recorded admission of guilt. She paused, her voice strengthening. And the cruelest part? He made my father choose silence. He held me hostage emotionally, knowing my dad would rather live with unbearable uncertainty than risk losing me completely. Alan Crawford died carrying that guilt, and Reverend Hale let him. So no, he didn't save anyone. He destroyed multiple lives while calling it God's work. Hale's serene expression finally cracked, something desperate flickering behind his eyes, but he said nothing. The defense's case was weak, built on psychiatric evaluations claiming Hale suffered from delusional disorder, genuinely believing his actions were divinely ordained. But the jury saw through it. After only 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that surprised no one. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, stating, "You weaponized faith to commit unconscionable acts. You robbed a child of her identity and a family of 20 years they can never reclaim. There is no redemption for what you've done, only consequences." As bailiffs led Hale away, he turned one last time to the courtroom, his voice ringing out. "History will vindicate me. Lily thrived under my guidance. That truth will outlive all of us." But Lily stood and spoke over him, her voice cutting through his delusion. "I didn't thrive because of you. I thrived in spite of you. And the only truth that matters is this: you're a kidnapper, not a savior. And I will spend the rest of my life reclaiming everything you tried to steal." The courtroom erupted in applause as Hale was led away, his conviction final, his legacy destroyed. But the story didn't end with a verdict. 3 months later, Lily stood at Alan Crawford's grave with Margaret beside her. She'd been visiting regularly, talking to the father she was slowly learning to remember through home videos, old letters, and Margaret's patient stories. "I forgive you," she whispered to the headstone. "I understand now why you made the choice you did. It wasn't the right choice, but it was a human one. And maybe that's what love looks like sometimes. Imperfect people making impossible decisions and hoping they're enough." She placed a white lily on the grave, continuing the tradition her father had started. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. Their relationship was still complicated, still filled with grief for the lost years, and the strangeness of learning to be mother and daughter as adults. But they were trying. Some days were harder than others. Some days Lily still felt more like Lucia, still dreamed in Spanish, still missed the mountains of Guatemala and the students she'd left behind. But she was learning that identity could be fluid, that a person could be both Lily and Lucia. That trauma didn't have to define you even though it shaped you. She'd started teaching piano at Cedarville Elementary, finding peace in the same music that had been stolen from her childhood. And every time a student played Fur Elise, she remembered a little more. Not just the notes, but the feeling of being loved, of being someone's daughter, of having a home that wasn't built on lies. Claire visited them often, having become an unexpected friend through the ordeal. She'd been promoted to chief detective, her work on the case earning national recognition. But she always said the real reward was watching Lily slowly come home to herself, piece by piece, memory by memory. One evening, as Lily sat at her childhood piano, the same one that had been in the house all along, her fingers found the opening notes of Fur Elise without conscious thought. And as the melody filled the house, something unlocked inside her. She remembered sitting here before, much smaller, her feet not quite reaching the pedals. She remembered Alan standing in the doorway listening with pride. She remembered feeling safe, loved, whole. The memory made her cry, but she kept playing. Because this was her truth now. Not the lie Hale had constructed, not the miracle Cedarville wanted her to be, but the messy, complicated, painful, beautiful reality of a woman who'd survived the unthinkable and was learning to live again. If you've stayed with this story until the end, comment below and tell me what resonates with you. Is it Lily's resilience? Alan's impossible choice? The danger of trusting blindly? Your thoughts create conversations that matter, that help others process their own experiences with betrayal, loss, and survival. Subscribe to this channel if you believe stories like this need to be told. Not sanitized, not simplified, but presented in all their painful complexity. Share this video with someone who needs to know that even when evil wins for 20 years, truth can still find its way home. The case of Cedarville's missing girl became the arrest no one could believe, not because of who committed the crime, but because of how deeply the betrayal ran, how completely one man's twisted faith destroyed multiple lives while the whole town watched without seeing. But it also became a story of survival, of a woman who refused to let her stolen childhood define her future, of a family learning to grieve and rebuild simultaneously, of a community confronting its own complicity and choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. Detective Claire Rowan, the woman who refused to let a cold case stay cold, often reflected on what the investigation taught her. That justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth finding its voice after decades of silence. That the most dangerous evil often wears the most trusted face. That redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about refusing to let it destroy your future. And that sometimes the only way home is through the very darkness you've spent your whole life trying to escape. Cedarville would never forget what happened. The church building where Hale had preached was sold, converted into a community center, where Margaret and Lily now taught music and art to local children. The white lilies continued appearing on the courthouse steps every October 14th, but now they came from dozens of people, a town-wide memorial for the years lost, and the truth finally found. And Lily Crawford, the girl who became Lucia Mendoza and then became herself again, learned that identity isn't something that can be stolen permanently. It can be buried, distorted, nearly erased. But the core of who you are survives in fragments waiting to be remembered. In melodies your fingers remember even when your mind doesn't. In the way coming home feels both foreign and familiar at once. Some wounds never fully heal, but they can transform into something else. Not scars that limit you, but stories that remind you of your strength, your survival, your refusal to let evil have the final word. That was the truth that outlived Reverend Michael Hale's delusions, that survived Alan Crawford's impossible silence, that brought Lily home not to who she was, but to who she could choose to become. And in the end, that choice, that freedom to define herself on her own terms, was the justice that mattered most. Thank you for witnessing this journey, for staying through the darkness to find whatever light exists on the other side, for understanding that some stories don't have neat endings, just new beginnings built on the ruins of what was lost. If this story changed you, let it move you to action. Subscribe, share, comment. But most importantly, look around at the trusted voices in your own life and remember that vigilance isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. That questioning authority isn't disrespectful, it's necessary. That protecting the vulnerable requires more than faith and good intentions, because somewhere right now, another Lily is being told that her abduction is salvation. Another Alan is being forced to choose between impossible options. Another Claire is deciding whether to dig deeper or let a cold case stay cold. And the only thing that stops the cycle is people like you, refusing to look away from difficult truths, refusing to accept comfortable lies, refusing to let evil hide behind the mask of righteousness. That's the real legacy of Cedarville's cold case. Not just the arrest that shocked a town, but the reminder that justice delayed isn't justice denied if someone, somewhere refuses to stop searching.